Welcome back to my channel for part 2 of my fully comprehensive tutorial on the new Leica Q3. And if you have not seen part 1, you can do so by clicking on the link which I will post down below in the info box, so you can see what I covered in part 1. I covered already a lot of ground here, in particular on drive mode, on focusing where we have lots of options, on exposure metering where we have 4 different settings here, and so on, exposure compensation, ISO. I stopped just before white balance, which will be the first topic of this video, and then in part 3 of my tutorial I will look into videography and will let you everything know you need to know to become a professional video shooter with the new Leica Q3. Let's kick this off. Alright, as I just said, the first setting we are going to look into is white balance, and that's on page number 2, just after auto ISO settings, and there are a bunch of settings here. The first one is auto, and if you're in auto mode, the camera decides what the right white balance is. And you see here how it's calibrating the color temperature, for instance, if I focus and meter light on Jennifer's body. Let's go quickly into status screen, let's see what we have. I'm here in autofocus single spot metering, and I have field autofocus, which is exactly what I want. And then you can go into the menu and can tweak this. For instance, you could go to cloudy, and if I go back into the live mode, you see this became a bit warmer here in the color. You can also, besides the other settings, go into the menu and say you want to have here the color temperature tweaked by yourself. And if I go to the right hand side, it becomes warmer. You see this here. And if I go from the 5000 where I was before to the left hand side, the color temperature becomes colder and more bluish. And that is something you can directly set if you want. So if I confirm this here by pushing the center button, then I have this temperature locked in. And you can also access this from the status screen, as I showed in part 1 of this video. And you see here, it's locked in at 5000K. And then here you could also switch. You could go back, for instance, to auto and choose your settings in this way. I'm now back in auto white balance. Let's quickly go to the status screen. So you see here AWB, and now let's go into an interesting option, which is the gray card. And if I do that and choose it, then I get a little rectangle in the middle of the frame, and this is the area where white balance is measured. So let's first of all take a shot now from the color LEDs in the background, which will change the white balance, and you will see this in a moment. So let's go up here. Here we have the color LEDs. Let's meter white balance, and in order to really meter it and lock it, you need to press down the shutter release button. So let's do this. It will sound to you like a shot. Alright, that's it. And let's now take an image of Jennifer with that locked white balance, which we metered on the color LEDs on the background. Here we go. And now let's change this to auto white balance so you see the difference. Let's go here to AWB. And then the camera will decide what the right white balance is. So let's take a shot of Jennifer. And let's go into play mode to have a look at that. So this is auto white balance. And you see how it looks like. And if I now switch to the image I shot with white balance locked at the background LEDs, it looks like this. And it has a bit of a green tint here. Do you see that? Let's go back. This is auto white balance. This is the metered white balance via the LEDs on the background wall. And you clearly see the difference here. This is the natural look. This is a bit more of a green tint because nobody would meter white balance on background LEDs. But in order to illustrate my point, that came in nice and handy. All right, that's already all on white balance. Let's go into the menu again and let's continue. So we will now go to photo file format, but that we already discussed in tutorial number 1. So we can choose between DNG, DNG and JPEG. So there is not more to say here. And the DNG resolution we also discussed already, and all the different options we had in order of mixing JPEG plus DNG, JPEG, DNG only, then with different resolutions on JPEG and DNG. And we figured out in part 1 that there are 15 combinations, which you also see when you go to the status screen and swipe along here the axis. You see it's all in 15 different combinations. I go here for LJPEG and LDNG. And we also have here JPEG settings, and I will cover the Leica Looks later because that is an interesting topic and needs the Leica Fotos App, and I want to introduce the Leica Fotos App first. But you have here, as mentioned in part 1, the maximum JPEG resolution. You can tweak your noise reduction. I typically have this on low, but you could go for medium if you wanted. You have film styles. These are filters, standard, vivid, natural, black and white filter, 2 of them. And then you can also tweak your film style settings. So let's go in that. If I want to tweak vivid, for instance, I get here a menu and I can go here to contrast, highlight, shadow and sharpness. And if I choose, for instance, shadow here, I can then go to the value and set this, for instance, to +2, or I can set it to -2. So this is very convenient to tweak, and in this way you get a different look on your JPEG image. I typically don't use that because it's something I do in post if I want to have this type of effects. But it works very nice, and if you're a JPEG shooter, that is an option you should explore. Then we have intelligent dynamic range. Leica Looks, as I said, I cover later. And here you can go on auto, high, standard, low and off. And I typically have this on auto. Leave it to the camera, but what it does is it brings more details and a bit more light into the shadows. It's something you can also achieve in post, in Lightroom for instance, or Capture One. But if you want to have it straight away in your JPEGs, then you should go for that setting and maybe switch it to standard, which is then an option which will help you, or you leave it to the camera and the camera will detect, are the shadows too dark, and then the camera will do the job for you. Simple like that. Next we have scene mode, and scene mode is a big help for beginners, because if you go into that, you can choose first of all auto, and then the camera is deciding what scene are you trying to shoot. So if for instance you're pointing the camera to fireworks, the camera will recognize this. You also have here the usual program, aperture priority, shutter speed priority and manual mode, which is what I typically have here. And then you have, I think, 9 different scenes which you can tweak here. So you have sports, portrait, landscape, that's 3, night portrait, snow, beach, fireworks, that's 6, and then candlelight, sunset and digiscoping, that's all in 9 different scenes. And let's have a look what happens if I go to some of them. Let's go here to my standard mode, which is program, aperture priority, shutter speed priority and manual mode. And if I look into that, I have currently, let's go here to a fixed shutter speed. Let's say we have here 1/60 seconds. Let's also go to an ISO value of, I have not programmed this here on my button because from my former tutorial, this was on exposure compensation. So let's go to ISO, and then I have here ISO, and then let's go to an ISO of 100. So you see now here, fully manual mode, ISO 100, f1.7, and that is tweaked of course on the aperture ring of the lens, and a shutter speed set by the shutter speed dial here on the top of the camera to 1/60 seconds. Now let's change the scene mode. Let's see what happens. And this can be nicely illustrated. Let's go here for instance to portrait. If I go to portrait and go back into live view, then you see here that the camera switched from a manual ISO of 100 to an auto ISO of 125. The aperture setting is still the same, it's f1.7, but the shutter speed changed from 1/60 seconds, which before I set up with my shutter speed dial here, to 1/80 seconds. And by the way, also the focusing mode changed to face and eye detection. And you see that was clearly before not on the live view and not set up in the camera. That just came from the scene mode. If I now go back here and say my scene mode should go back to where I was before, I should get the former parameters. And you see here it is, ISO 100, f1.7, 1/60 seconds, and field autofocus and not face detection and eye recognition. Just to make another example, because I want to point out one more thing here, which I think confirms that for beginners this scene mode is ingenious. Let's switch here to fireworks. So let's go to scene, and then on scene let's go down here to fireworks, and watch what happens now. All of a sudden it did not only go to auto ISO 100, and depending on how dark the scene is, ISO can now climb up because we are on auto ISO. It also changed the aperture from widest open f1.7 to an f8.0, and I didn't even touch the aperture ring on the lens. That's all done by the camera. It also switched from 1/60 seconds on exposure time to a long exposure of 4 seconds, and most astonishingly, you see that Jennifer is blurry and no longer sharp, and that by half pressing the shutter button, what I just do now here, it's not focusing. Because the camera knows that fireworks need an infinity focus and switched automatically into manual focus and overrules everything I'm doing here by just setting the lens into infinity focus. That is an ingenious feature for people who are not yet familiar with manual photography but want to have quick and nice results. Alright, going to page number 3 now. The next one is optical image stabilization. So here we have auto, and then we have off or on. Now here's something important to note. First of all, if you're on auto, the camera knows, based on the sensors in the camera, whether you need the support by image stabilization. And if you need it because you're shooting handhold with a comparably longer exposure, the camera will switch on by itself the optical image stabilization, which happens in the lens, and will help you to get a reasonably good shot. If you switch it off, then the camera will not help you. There will be no optical image stabilization at all. And that is the mode which saves you most of the power, because if you have it on, it will consume a lot of power, because optical image stabilization means the camera is permanently reacting to any change you do in the way you handhold your camera, in the way you set up your shooting parameters, and is always trying to compensate for any shakes and movements or vibrations of the camera. And I recommend to have this on auto, because this is the best setting. If you have a comparably fast shutter speed, optical image stabilization will not kick in. If you have the camera on a tripod and by the sensors it realizes you don't have any shakes and vibrations, it will not use and consume power, the optical image stabilization. But if you need it, if you want to shoot at 1/10 seconds, for instance, then the camera will recognize this and will help you with optical image stabilization. So I think being on auto here is the right thing. Having said that, on a tripod, I recommend to switch it off. I never had any issues on auto when I did shoot a Leica Q camera on a tripod, but I think best practice is to switch it to off if you have the camera on a tripod. The next setting is photo aspect ratio, and you have here the full frame of the sensor, 3:2. You have a 4:3 ratio, a 1:1, which is a square, and a cinematic aspect ratio, which is 16:9. And I typically have this on 3:2. I want to use also on my JPEGs the full frame of the full frame sensor, but whatever you set up here will affect JPEGs only. In the RAW file, you still have the full frame visible and you can still post-process it and do not lose information. So that is a setting I hardly use. Then we have perspective control is currently off. If I switch it on, I get some frame lines here, and you see this best if I move a little bit with the camera. You see them here, and they are based on the internal sensors of the camera and help you to get a steady shot. So let's see what happens here if I move here a little bit and focus on Jennifer. Let's take a shot and you will see how it automatically corrects the perspective. Let's go into play mode. So this is the full scene. Let's go into play mode and you see it cut off part of the image, basically cropped in but corrected for straight lines and not any falling lines. And that is a really good feature. It's the first time we see this on a Leica Q camera. It's not on the Leica Q2. It never found its way into the Leica Q2, but it's now here on the Leica Q3. And I have, by the way, a fully fledged tutorial on perspective control on the Leica SL2 and SL2S on my channel. I'll link the video down below in the info box, and you will see how ingenious Leica is solving that perspective control problem by making sure that the information of where the frames are is stored in the DNG, so the RAW file, and then in Lightroom you basically can use this with a push of a button, but you can also convert back to the image if there would be no perspective control. It's a really good feature. I recommend using it. I use it very often on cities and architecture. And as I said, in that video, which I will link down below in the info box, you will learn everything about that feature you need to know, because it works exactly the same way on the Leica Q3 as it works on the Leica SL2 and SL2S. Next, we have here shutter type, and we have three settings here. We have mechanical, electronic shutter, and hybrid. Now, mechanical shutter will allow you to go for the long exposures and then as fast as 1/2000 seconds. And then this is end of story. On the electronic shutter, you can go long, but you can also go as fast as 1/16,000 seconds. And hybrid means that you have basically the camera deciding depending on shutter speed. So in the range from long exposures until as fast as 1/2000 seconds, the camera will go for the mechanical shutter. And if it gets faster, between 1/2000 seconds and 1/16,000 seconds, the camera will switch automatically to electronic shutter. Hybrid is the setting I recommend and is the setting I'm using all the time, because you should use the mechanical shutter as long as it is possible. And then if you want to go faster than 1/2000 seconds, if you're on hybrid, the camera automatically switches to electronic shutter and enables that. Let's quickly try this out. Let's go to mechanical shutter. Let's go into the status screen and let's tap on exposure time. And then you see the marker is on the very right hand side, and that means you cannot go faster than 1/2000 seconds if you are on mechanical shutter. Let's go back into the menu and let's switch this. Sorry, now I jumped too far. Let's go back here. Now you go to hybrid and see what happens if I go back into the status screen. Still on the shutter speed dial, I'm at 1/2000 seconds. In the status screen, if I tap on exposure time, the marker jumped from the very right hand side now more to the left hand side, and now I can move it and can go faster. And you see here this goes, as I mentioned before, as fast as 1/16,000 seconds. You cover the same range of shutter speeds if you go for electronic only, but that is a setting I don't recommend because the readout time of the Leica Q3 sensor is not fast enough to avoid rolling shutter effects under all circumstances. So my recommendation here really is go for hybrid. The camera will use the mechanical shutter as long as it is possible, and then when you want to go really fast, it switches automatically to electronic shutter. Very easy to use and actually a really good setting. Flash settings is something I'm not going to cover in this video. I will actually make a separate video on flash photography with the Leica Q3 because there is something really interesting going on here which not many people are aware of. So there will be a separate video on that. And then we have a setting for exposure preview, and that switches between PASM and PAS. And that means if you're on live view and half pressing the shutter button, you get here in program, aperture priority and shutter speed priority, a fully fledged preview of how the image looks like in terms of colors, white balance, exposure, and what have you. But if you have it on PASM, it will also give you that preview in the fully manual mode, and that's the setting you should have at all times. Coming now to page 4, we have auto review. And auto review can be at off, or you can set the timer. 1 second preview of an image you have shot, 3 seconds, 5 seconds permanent, or until the shutter button is pressed. And I typically have this on permanent. This is the setting I'm using. So if I take a shot of Jennifer here, then the image is staying on the display and I can tap in to zoom and so on until I leave it, for instance, pressing the shutter button or pushing a menu button or something else. So permanent here is, in my opinion, the right setting. Then next we have long exposure noise reduction. I have this typically on, but you can also switch it off. And there are situations where you could actually decide for off. Let's say you take a series of night shots, and whenever you take, let's say, a 30 or 60 seconds exposure as an illustrative example, the camera will use the same time after your shot to do a dark frame subtraction in order to calculate out any hot pixels and any noise. And that can be quite tedious. In particular, if you go longer, let's say you shoot for 2 minutes and then you have to wait after each 2-minute exposure another 2 minutes for noise reduction. And you can easily also remove noise in post. And in these situations, I actually go for off, but my standard setting here is on. The next group of settings is under customized control. And that's a really good feature because here you can customize the camera for your own personal workflow. Let's go into that. And there are, first of all, favorites. Now, what are favorites? If I go here to the status screen, and you see here that between the status screen and between the menu, there's nothing in between. So let's go there back here. Here's the status screen. If I push the menu button again, I come to page number 1 in the menu. If I push it again, it goes to page number 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, and so on. But if you edit the favorites, there will be an additional page between the status screen and the menu page number 1, which contains only elements where you want to have quick access. So let's try this out. Let's go back into customize control. Let's go to edit favorites. And now here we have a long list what we can choose to appear on that page between the status screen and the official menu page number 1. So let's say I want to have here interval shooting. So I switch it on. I want to have exposure bracketing. And I also want to have here, let's say, oh, that's a good one from tutorial number 1, autofocus, tracking, start position. Let's switch these 3 settings on. And now if I go into the menu here, the status screen is the first page to come up, but the second screen marked here with an asterisk is actually the page where my favorites appear. And you see we have exactly the ones here I have chosen before. We have interval shooting, we have exposure bracketing, and we have autofocus, tracking, start position. And then we have a very last one, which takes me then to the main menu where I left it off, which was on page 4 because I was customizing controls here. Simple like that. Let's go back into customize control. So edit favorites we covered. You switch on what you want to appear on that page between the status screen and the menu page number 1. Then we have different function buttons. And I showed this in tutorial part 1 that if you press and hold a customizable button, like for instance this one here, I press and hold, I can select a function which will be assigned to that customizable button. And currently it's toggling between photo and video mode. So if I press that button, once, it toggles into video mode. If I press it again, it toggles back into still image mode. But the list here is very long, and maybe a lot of these options you don't want to see here when you press and hold that customizable button to assign a function to that button. And you can actually select what's appearing in that list I'm currently scrolling through in the menu where we just left customize controls. So let's go in there and let's go back here. And if I choose FN button 2, so you will find in the manual that the first button here is FN1 and the second button here is FN2, then I can toggle on and off what's appearing in that list I was just scrolling through. And let's quickly do that. So I want to have the photo video toggle functionality to potentially be assigned to button 2. And I also want to have here, I don't want to have the levels, I don't want to have the digital zoom. I want to have these three here, so auto exposure lock and auto focus lock. I want to not have the magnification, so I toggle this off. Drive mode I don't need. Interval shooting I have under favorites. Exposure bracketing I have under favorites. Self timer I don't need here. Focusing I don't need here, and so on. I just deactivate everything else for a moment, and then we go back into that function button and see what's on the list, and you will see that the list is thinned out significantly. What's missing here is one button which says switch everything off or switch everything on. That would be clearly more convenient than scrolling through that list and doing that tedious routine work here. But it is what it is. All right, almost done. Maybe I want to keep the Leica Fotos app. Let's switch this on. And format card I definitely don't need on a customizable button, and acoustic signal I also don't need there. Okay, let's go back into live view. And if I now press shortly that button here, it toggles between video mode and photo mode because that's assigned. But if I press and hold, you see that list is now thinned out and all the positions which we saw before are gone here, and I have only the ones appearing here which I toggled on in that menu entry under customize controls before. It's very easy and very simple. And if we compare it, if I press and hold here, I have that very short list. If I press and hold on function button number 1, it's still the long list because I have not customized yet in the menu what I want to appear there in terms of functions to be assigned to that button. That's how it works, and that's how you can customize it for your own personal workflow. The next customization, which works in exactly the same way, is the center button, and that's this one here, and it works in exactly the same way. If I currently press it very shortly, it will go into magnification because that's what's assigned to this button. And if I press it again, it goes even closer. If I press it again, it goes back, and then it zooms in again, and then it goes back. And if I want to get rid of it, I just press the shutter release button very quickly. So that's what's currently assigned, but in the same way as on FN2 and FN1, I can press and hold and can assign a function. And again, you have this very long list. And again, you can go into the menu under customize control and let the camera know what you want to see here. It's exactly the same procedure. You can toggle on functions or you can toggle them off, and then you can choose them later by press and hold. And then we have another customizable button which has exactly the same functions, and that's here under the Thumbwheel button. That's the button here on top of the rear control wheel, and here we have the same situation as what I just demonstrated on the center button and FN2 and FN1. And then we have the wheel assignment, which is this one here. So I can turn this, and here we can go for ISO, exposure compensation, auto and off. And I demonstrated this already when we spoke about exposure compensation in tutorial part 1. The next setting here in the menu is digital zoom, and I covered this in detail in my intro video to the Leica Q3. I also showed to you that with the metadata, the Leica Q3 tells Lightroom what crop you have applied here. And the simulations are 28, that's without a crop, then 35mm focal length, 50mm, 70 and 90. The 90 is new on the Leica Q3, was not there on the Leica Q2. And Lightroom knows by the metadata of the image what crop you have chosen, and it will appear in that way even in the raw file, but you can take it back and win back the original frame. As I said, I showed this in my intro video. I will link the video down below in the info box so you can look this up if you want. No need to speak about this any longer here. The next feature is a very important one, and that's user profiles. And you see currently we have only one profile here, which is the default profile, and that's active. And you can here store up to 6 different configurations for your camera, which you can then recall very quickly if you need them. So let's try this out. I've now set up here one configuration, and if we go into the status screen, you see I have an aperture of f1.7, I have a shutter speed not auto shutter speed, but fixed here of 1/250 seconds. I have a fixed ISO value of 400. And I also want to have single here on autofocus. And I think field autofocus is fine, but on the metering side, I would like to have spot. Let's say this is my configuration and I need this for a certain workflow when I take the camera out in the field. Now I can store this under user profiles. So let's have a look how that works. So we go into the menu again, into user profiles. Still we have only the default profile here. And now let's go to manage profiles. And then I can say my current configuration with all the parameters I just set can be stored as a profile. And let's save this as user 1. You see there are 6 storage places here. And then it asks me if I want to save this as user 1. I say yes. And by the way, if I go back here to the higher level, I can also rename this. So if I go here into user 1, I can give it a different name and could, for instance, say this is just, call it use. You know, that's for the sake of simplicity. Let's confirm this. And then this has also a tailor-made name here, namely use. So I've stored this, and now whenever I'm in the default profile or in some other profile, let's go here. I can choose this here. Let's go back to default and let's choose it. Then you see I'm now back in auto ISO, and for instance on autofocus I'm back to intelligent autofocus. I have here multi-field metering instead of spot metering, what I had before, and so on. If I now want to quickly switch back to the configuration I stored before, I go here to use, and you see it also recalls the name I gave it in the menu a moment ago. And now I'm in use, and now we have ISO 400. We have here the spot metering, as I said. We have not IAF, but autofocus single. And we have all these parameters back, which I set up before, shutter speed of 1/250 seconds, and so on. So in this way, you can store up to 6 configurations, and you can recall them quickly via the status screen, or again, you customize a function button for that, and then you can also access it via a mechanical button. That's the way it works. I think it's very useful. If you get used to it, you can store different configurations. For instance, one configuration for time lapses where you only want to shoot JPEGs, or for the night sky where you have long exposures, and all these settings you need for that you can store in up to 6 configurations for quick access. Quite nice. The next setting here is capture assistance. Let's go into that, and we can choose here grid on or off. If I choose on, I get a grid overlay in my live view. We can also switch it off again. I can also have clipping and zebra, which is a standard indication. You see here, when I half press the shutter button, I get some areas where we have too much light, where it's overexposed. I can go back here and switch this off again. We can also have the level gauge or level meter, and then we can see whether the tripod constellation with the camera is level metered here. You see the green line at this point in time. And we can have, in addition to that, also the histogram, and we can also combine them. If I switch both of them on, they will both appear in the live view. And you see here now, if I now move my shutter speed dial, for instance, the histogram here in the upper left hand side corner will change. You see how it's turning to the brighter side, and here it's turning to the darker side. It's very simple, works in a nice way, and these overlays are very often very useful if you can toggle them on and off here, so that you have them when you need them and get the information about your exposure, your level meter, or what have you. All right, we are changing sides from page number 4 to page number 5. And here we have the play mode setup. And here we can first of all say group display mode. That is something very useful. I'm going to demonstrate this in a moment. You can also have in play mode clipping. That means if you take a picture and you press the play button, then you will see the same information about highlights being clipped as you just saw it under zebra and clipping in live view. And we also can show the histogram. Let's switch all of them off for a moment. Let's go here and let's take a picture and let's overexpose it. So let's go here to something very bright. Let's say 1/30 seconds. We only see Jennifer. The background is now heavily overexposed. Let's take an image. Let's go into play mode. And then we have this here. Let's double tap. So you see Jennifer is here. And now if I go into these overlays, let's go out in live view. So we go here into play mode setup and we say we want to see the clipping. Let's switch it on. If I go back into play mode, it shows me the clipping. You see that? Quite nice, and it's actually very useful if you want to identify smaller areas in an image where you have overexposure and where you need to correct for the next shot. Quite useful. Let's go back here into live view and then into the setting. Let's switch this off. You can also have the histogram or combinations of them. Let's switch this on. If I go into play mode, I get now my histogram here in the upper left hand side corner, and you see how much this is skewed to the right hand side because the background behind Jennifer is heavily overexposed. That's the way it works. The setting I skipped now is group display mode, and that's a very interesting one. So I switched this off for the time being. And if you're shooting a series of images, for instance in continuous shooting burst mode, then all images will be grouped which belong to that particular sequence. Or if you shoot intervalometer images and everything in that series of shots, in the sequence of shots, will be grouped into one group, and only the first image of that series will be displayed, and you can manage them as a group. And that is quite good because you need this from time to time. Otherwise it's sometimes very hard to manage a sequence of images, for instance, being shot in the intervalometer setting. And we can try this out very quickly. So let's go into drive mode. And in drive mode, let's go to continuous shooting. Let's say we have 4 frames per second. It will be very boring because it's always just Jennifer, my beautiful model here. And let me shoot that sequence, and let's switch group off. Let's go here back into the menu. Let's say play mode setup, this is off. All right, let's take a series of shots by continuously pressing the shutter release button. I think that's enough. The camera is still buffering here and writing the images to the SD card. And if I go into play mode, I have now that boring sequence here. So we have image number 1, 2, 3, you see here the counter, and they're all the same because I shot the same scene in burst mode and continuous shooting. You see that? All right, let's do the same thing now by switching group mode on. Let's go back here into play mode, and let's say this is on now. So we repeat the sequence. The buffer is empty by now, so we have some headroom here. Let's release it, and let's give the camera some time to buffer. If we now go into play, we have a different appearance. Instead of an image only and these frames from the continuous burst shooting one after another, we have now here a play button, we have another icon, and there are certain things we can do. So first of all, we can play the sequence, which is super boring because it's just Jennifer in front of us. But you see here now the progress bar, and I can now scroll between these 18 shots I've taken from frame number 1 in the group up to frame number 18. I can also convert these 18 frames into a video if I want, and it says here create video, and I can go for yes and do so if I want. I don't want to do this at this point in time. And if I go back into play, I have here another symbol, and that can be activated by using the control button down here. So if I press that, watch how the icon is changing. It's changing from a group symbol of images to a single image, and it shows me here that's frame number 1. Then with the directional arrow on horizontal direction, I can scroll through these images, and you see now I'm at frame number 5, and it goes to frame number 18 as we just saw in the sequence. And that is how it works. So there are lots of things you can do here. It's very convenient to have them grouped and to deal with them as a group. And as I said, just frame number 1 will be the first frame you see. Instead of seeing all frames, they are hidden behind that frame number 1. The next group of settings concerns the display and the electronic viewfinder, EVF. If I go into that, I have here under EVF versus LCD several settings. I can choose LCD only. If I do that, let's choose it, then the sensor here which measures how close something gets to the electronic viewfinder is deactivated. So if I approach this here, nothing happens. The view always stays on the LCD. If I go here for electronic viewfinder only, then the same would apply to the EVF and my LCD would be deactivated. I'm not doing it right now because otherwise I will have to lift up the camera to my eye. Then we have auto, and if we are on auto, the sensor here is activated. So if my eye approaches the EVF, the view switches from the LCD to the EVF. If my eye goes away, then the view switches back to the LCD, and that is my standard setting here. And then we have EVF extended, and that is an interesting setting. Let's go into that because now I'm in shooting mode, and in shooting mode, because I'm usually seeing here the live view, but that is now gone and jumped from the LCD into the EVF. I have in shooting mode the EVF activated, but if I want to control something like play, for instance, then it switches back to the LCD. Or if I push the menu button, it also switches back to the LCD. And that's the way EVF extended is working. So we can easily deactivate this here again and go to my standard setting, which is auto. Then we have the eye sensor sensitivity that can be low or high, self-explanatory. We have LCD brightness. We don't have to go into that. LCD color adjustment and EVF brightness and EVF color adjustment. And here we have the frame rate. If you want to make sure that there is no lagging in the way you see things in the EVF, then go to 120 frames per second, but be aware that this costs you a bit more battery lifetime and you will have more consumption of power. And I typically have this on 60. I think the EVF with 60 frames per second is just good enough for me. And that's all the settings you have here. Let's now talk about the Leica Fotos app. And in order to make this tutorial an authentic experience, I've again reset my Leica Q3 to factory settings. And I also have a fresh smartphone here, the Samsung Galaxy S23 Ultra, which has never been connected to the Leica Q3 before. And I want to show you how to connect this and how to use it. And then I also want to look into the Leica Looks, which you can download via the Photos app to your Leica Q3. So let's kick this off. The first thing we need to do is we go into the menu on page number 5, which is here, and then Leica Photos. And then we go into pair. And that basically sets the camera into waiting state to connect with the smartphone. Let's go down here and let's press plus. Let's swipe to the Q cameras. Let's go here. Let's select the Q3 and then we say continue. If we do it, it says camera found, Leica Q3. We say connect. And by the way, the user experience is slightly different on the iPhone, but it's almost the same. So don't be worried. If you understand it here, you can also repeat that on the iPhone. And you see it says here connection setup, connecting to camera Wi-Fi. We also see activity here on the camera LCD screen. And with some luck, we get this connected wirelessly. Then it says camera edit on the smartphone. We turn not on geotagging, but we could if we wanted to get GPS data into the metadata of images. We see the gallery coming up here. And we can now go to remote shooting. And if I tap on that, I get a representation of my live view on the LCD screen of the camera on my smartphone. Now I can, for instance, take a shot here, but I can also toggle between video mode and you see how spot on this reacting. Back to photo mode, we have the self timer here. We have all kinds of options. Here we can tweak white balance, file format, JPEG resolution, exposure metering, DNG resolution and Leica Looks. I come to that later. We can also leave the remote shooting application here and go into camera settings and then we go here and then we see, for instance, the firmware. You can update the firmware via the Leica Fotos app on your iPhone or your Android phone. You have all kinds of settings here. And what I want to cover next is Leica Looks. And for Leica Looks, if you go into the menu, you go into JPEG settings and that is here. And then we have here the Leica Looks, which is a new innovation from Leica. And if you go into that, it says, please use Leica Photos to download Leica Looks. Okay, let's do this. The question is, where can we do it here? And if you're not familiar with the app, it's very hard to figure this out. So the place where you finally get the Leica Looks is actually here with these icons. If you tap on that, you see here contemporary, classic, blue, selenium, and sepia. So there are 5 of them. And if I tap on contemporary, for instance, I can now download it by saying transfer to the Leica Q3, which happens instantly. We can also go to classic, transfer it to the Leica Q3. That's good. Let's go to blue. Let's transfer it. Good. And then the last 2 ones is selenium. And then we have here sepia. Let's go there. And we transfer this too. That's all. So the Leica Looks are now on the camera. And if I now go in the menu into Leica Looks, I find them here: contemporary, classic, blue, selenium, and sepia. Let's go back into live view and then we see how the appearance of the image changed here. Or let's go to classic, for instance, and let's have a look how this looks like. A totally different look. These looks have been tailor-made, calibrated by Leica experts in the headquarters, so they are supposed to give you something special, and clearly it's fun to play with them. There is one confusing element with Leica Looks, and you see here that currently we are in Leica Selenium, so I've selected this in the menu. Let's quickly go there. and you have here selenium, and you can go to classic, for instance, then it's a different Leica look. But how do you actually get out of that mode that your JPEG is again shown as a standard and not with a Leica look? Now it says Leica CLS here on the LCD screen, and you do that by going back into JPEG settings, and that is a bit unexpected what I'm going to show here. You go actually to film style and then you say standard again, and this overrides then the Leica looks, and now you see here standard, and you are back to what you are used to see before you had the Leica looks loaded into your camera. Simple like that, but not really intuitive. After the Leica Fotos app, we have format card. That's self-explanatory. I'm not doing it now because I want to keep what's on the card. We have camera information. Let's skip camera settings for the moment, and there you get your firmware version. My recent one is 110. We also have some other informations like the MAC address, license information, copyright information. That is currently off. I typically have this on, and then I can feed in here information and the artist. So let's go into that. Let's delete everything I have here, and let's say this is math photographer. So let's try to do this from behind the camera. Not so easy, but will work, hopefully. Photographer. Okay, see, that was the mistake. As I said, from behind the camera, not so easy, is a small keyboard. But now you see this here, and you can do the same on artist. And then this will be written in the metadata, and if someone steals your images and forgets to clean up the metadata, you can prove that this is your image and you're the authoritative source for that image and for the art coming with that image. So that's what happens here under copyright information, and then it goes back to firmware again. And then the very last entries we have here, language, that's easy, self-explanatory, and here you can reset the camera, which I did at the very beginning of this video. And then the last one we need to discuss is camera settings. And first of all, you can edit the first letter of your file name, and I typically have this on Q because this is a Q camera from Leica. Then you can reset your image numbering here. I don't want to do it at this point in time. You can also go into power saving, and auto power off I typically have at the maximum, namely 10 minutes. I don't want the camera to go off all the time, and then I need to wake it up. And on display off, I have it typically at 5 minutes, which is also the longest period you can set up here. And then this is also done. Acoustic signal, very simple, self-explanatory, volume between low and high. Electronic shutter sound I keep at off, but if you switch it on, you get some sound confirmation even under electronic shutter, not as silent as you saw previously in the video. And then autofocus confirmation is a good one. Typically here, if I half press the shutter button and it focuses on Jennifer, you see that the rectangle here turns green, but I have no sound confirmation. If I go back into this menu entry and go here into autofocus confirmation, then it will give me a beep when focus was found. Listen. And now to also demonstrate this, you can also tweak then here the volume. If I go to high, it will be a bit louder. You hear? But I find this not so nice, so typically I have this off because I see in the green color that focus has been found, but it's a matter of taste, of course, what you set up here. So let's switch this off. And let's go back here. Then we have USB charging. I always have this on. I typically charge my camera via the USB-C port. I hardly use the external charger. And then we have the USB mode. And if you want to, for instance, connect your iPhone with the USB-C and Lightning cable to the camera here, which is a standard procedure, the cable is in the box, then go under all circumstances for Apple MFI. But there are other modes here, for instance, PTP, mass storage, if you want to transfer images. And you can also get the camera to ask you, when it realizes that a cable has been connected, what you want to use. So there are different options here. And then we have Wi-Fi settings here. I don't think I need to cover that because that's easy. And we also spoke about that quickly when we looked into the Leica Fotos app. Date and time is clear. And then pixel mapping is actually done automatically every 2 weeks. But if you would have some hot pixels or stuck pixels somewhere in between, you can do the pixel mapping manually. And if you confirm it, then it asks you whether you really want to do it. And then the camera does the procedure, which it typically does every 2 weeks, just ad hoc at this particular point in time. All right, that's it. I think I covered now in part number 1 of my tutorial and part number 2 every single setting for still images. And in part number 3 of my tutorial, we'll swipe here switch into video mode and I will explain everything to you you might want to know or need to know for professional video shooting with the new Leica Q3. If you liked that video, don't forget to drop me a thumbs up. Stay tuned on my channel, there's always more to come. Thanks for watching, stay safe and healthy, and of course, peace out.